Okay, so today we're going to start talking about why was Great Britain the first nation to initiate the machine age. Now, for those of you, all of you in AP World would remember this. This is kind of similar to what we talked about in AP World. Now we're going to go into a little bit more detail. So, the first question is, why was England the best place for the Industrial Revolution to begin? Now, a couple of things politically. Great Britain in the 50 years following 1780 had social mobility. And England, I mean, it wasn't complete social mobility, but there definitely was the ability to move up and move around in the social scale more so than in any other places in Europe. Also, between 1688 to 1832, the British government was controlled by the land-owning class, and we have a very stable government. So we don't see the crazy chaos that we see happening in France or the rest of Europe because of the Napoleonic Wars or the French Revolution. And so here Napoleon had said that England was that nation of shopkeepers. But because they were a nation of shopkeepers, that's why they were kind of well situated for an industrial revolution. Now also, there was something called the Little Ice Age from 1350 to 1700, where we see there was this medieval warm period. Bottom line, 17th century agriculture, which is really what we're trying to focus on here right now, was very backwards. It was pretty much the same type of methods that were being used back in the Middle Ages. We've already talked about this whole concept of the common field, the commons, and these are called gleaners. And so what these are like the very, very poor. And what they do is after the harvest has occurred, these people are allowed to go back and pick up whatever is left off, and then they can kind of like live off of that. But this kind of shows you where we see production of grain surplus, where grain is being traded, and where grain is needed. And then we also can see kind of the yields. So we're seeing between 1400 and 1800, because Great Britain is that light blue, Great Britain's production of grain is increasing very rapidly, and it's increasing and kind of like shooting up around 1700, whereas in France, Spain, and Italy, it's kind of going down. It's going to have a spike, and then it's going to go back down again. Bottom line, England is going to have an agricultural revolution, and this agricultural revolution is going to make it possible for there to be an industrial revolution in England. The landowners wanted to increase their yield and increase their income, and they began experimenting in cultivation, and that's why we start to see this agricultural revolution all kind of egged on by the Enclosure Movement, which we're going to talk about in a second. But these are the cereal crops that are being grown across Europe, which is kind of like the mainstay of most people's diets. We also see for England, another reason why they were situated for an industrial revolution is you can see the whole country is kind of crisscrossed with rivers. And then they built canals between 1760 and 1800, which made it even easier to connect the area. You see mostly in the south, and what's referred to as the Midlands around Manchester and Leeds, those are the centers of woolen cloth production, and that was done in what was called the cottage industry, which we talked about in a previous video. We also see England had areas of metal production, and they had coal producing areas. So they had iron, they had coal, they had agriculture, agricultural revolution, they had navigable rivers, and then canals that kind of made up for any lack of navigable rivers. This kind of put them into a position that was going to make them well situated for an industrial revolution. So here you can see some of the early canals that were built, and this was kind of their earliest transportation infrastructure. The Enclosure Act is also going to be something that is going to help encourage the Industrial Revolution. So Parliament passes a series of Enclosure Acts, putting land under private ownership, while the rest of Europe, like France, for instance, is still kind of in this feudal system. Land became centralized because of the Enclosure Act in the hands of small, wealthy landowners. And because of the agricultural revolution, they were able to produce more food with less people. And because food then becomes cheaper, people didn't have to spend almost everything that they earned on food. It also freed labor up for other things, and so a lot of the English countryside, those people were wage earners. And this was also occurring at a time that Britain had a colonial empire, they had command of the sea, so this also put them into a good position. Plus, there was few economic controls in England at the time. Very much was a laissez-faire type of economy. And that also put them into a good position to lead them towards an industrial revolution. Again, here you could see kind of where the coal fields are produced, where the larger towns are, where you have exposed coal fields, where you start to have industrial areas. So you see that coal fields and industrial areas kind of tend to go hand in hand. And then, of course, England is going to have some of the earliest railroad systems. So as far as you could see, the increase in coal mining in Britain, especially with the onset of steam production, and that's going to make coal more important so they can have a source to heat the water to create the steam. Here you can see some of the enclosed lands today. You can see what one of these farmers markets in the small towns would have looked like prior to the revolution. Village school in the 1700s. This is the raw materials that the British had. Their ports, their canals, railways, again, coalfields, iron ore, copper mining, lead mining, tin mining, and the centers of population in England. So you could see that England, particularly London, was one of the most urbanized areas in all of Europe, by far outpacing, everyone else in Europe. This shows industry and population. So you can see England was a pretty large population center. This is in the 18th century, and they're going to be producing textiles and metals. And also the fact that the peasants had full emancipation in England is also going to help them on their path towards industrialization. And this is the growth of England's foreign trade in the 18th century, and you could see the trajectory going up very sharply, and you can see at the bottom an 18th century English port. We start to see the rise of the middle class with the Nouveau Riche, the capitalist entrepreneur, begin to develop in England. I'll talk about this in class. Now, because most of the peasants were wage earners, even in the countryside, they did things, like I said before, engage in the cottage industry, or sometimes referred to as the putting out system. So they would spin and weave thread, or they would make lace. So you can kind of see the whole system of how this would go. And there were many advantages to this, because this allowed peasants to supplement their agricultural incomes. It allowed them to take advantage of the winter months. It allowed them to still make money while it was not possible for them to farm. They could avoid the merchants could avoid higher wages and often regulations of urban labor. So it was easier to reduce the numbers of workers when the economy was bad, because, you just didn't sell your, unfinished wool. The merchants could acquire capital, which would later play a part in funding the Industrial Revolution itself. The peasants could acquire skills, and young people could start to separate their households earlier and contributing to population growth. Now, there were also disadvantages. When demand rose, this system is going to be kind of inefficient. Merchant capitalists found it difficult to induce peasant workers to increase their output. The peasants are going to work as fast as they wanted to work, and there really was no way for the merchants to force them. So this is what's going to lead them into a factory system, because all the workers were concentrated in one place under the supervision of a manager, and then water or steam power could easily be applied to those areas. And so here you can see apprentices at their looms. This is an etching from 1687. So the next question I'm going to ask you, and I'm sorry that I don't have it on a slide, how did inventions in the textile industry allow the textile industry to grow? So one of the first things that's going to be invented is going to be something done by John Kay in 1733. It's called the fly shuttle. Originally, the loom was something that was a two-man operation, and now one person instead of two could operate the loom, which increased weaving output. The next major invention in 1760 was something called the spinning jenny, which was a mechanized spinning wheel. Now, Richard Arkwright, he's considered the pioneer of the factory system. He invented something called the water frame, which could spin multiple threads at once. So it first operated on water, and then in the 1780s, it moved to steam power. And this is another major reason why these productions had to leave the homes and go into factories. So with factory production, Production is concentrated in one place, located near sources of power, and it requires a lot of capital investment. And only about 10% of English industry was in factories in 1850. But here you can see textile workers in England as it rises between 1830 and 1850. And the factory system created a rigid schedule, a 12 to 14 hour day, very dangerous conditions, and pretty mind-numbing monotony. Because you're pretty much doing the same thing just over and over and over and over again, which is why actually there would be a lot of accidents. But the mechanical spinning at the time then began to overwhelm the hand weavers, and so in 1800 we're going to see the invention of the power loom, and then the mechanization of production that is going to put the strain on the production of raw cotton. They weren't growing enough cotton to catch up with the demand, which is why actually the cotton gin, which was done in the United States, is going to be an important invention, because then that made it easier to process the raw cotton. But so here you can see this is a textile factory with workers in England. You can see all the multiple bobbins of thread that are being spun at once. And then you could see the young workers who were there kind of switching the bobbins. Here you can see one of these more mechanized looms. So like I said before, the fly shuttle, the power loom, these are all the important inventions that are going to happen. And then the steam engine. So the next question, question 3, how did advancements in steam engines allow for improved energy and transportation? So the energy shortage in England became very severe in the 18th century. There was a wood shortage, and you needed wood to make charcoal to power the engines and to smelt iron. And coal was commonly used to heat homes and had never been used before in commercial manufacturing. The issue with coal mining is they needed an efficient way to pump the water out of the mines, and before that was using animal power. But in 1780s, James Watt and his partner, I don't know why that just happened. Okay, so James Watt and his partner Bolton invented an efficient steam engine that could power water pumps to pump water out of the mines, and they also were able to start producing blast furnaces, which allows you to create a much higher heat, which you need to melt the iron. And the advancements in iron allowed for steam-powered riverboats. And so in the 1820s, we start to see locomotives, and by the 1840s, we start to see the era of railroad construction. The first railroad being, here you can see an early locomotive, but the first locomotive railroad line was in 1830. It was the connecting Manchester to Liverpool. And this encouraged even larger factories and a more sophisticated machinery. So we could also see steamships begin to be built, which is important because they can move goods to market much faster. You can see here the impact of the railroad. So in 1836, it would take 43 hours to travel from London to Edinburgh, and that was knocked down to 12.25 hours. Liverpool, it was a 24-hour trip, and it was knocked down to a 6.5-hour trip. So that's pretty significant. Brighton was a 6-hour trip, and now it was an 1.25-hour trip. And so many people thought that the railroads were kind of very scary things, but they were necessary in kind of helping bring England towards an industrial age. So the last question is, how did these advancements affect England? And so we can see here wages in 1830 in Lancashire, that there were workers under 11. And you also notice how when the kids are young, their wages, boy versus girl, are pretty close. The girls are getting paid a little bit less, but it's not that drastic. When they get to be in their 20s to their 40s, 30s, you could see just how drastic that change, the gap in wages is. And you could see here, many in the coal mines, many of the people that were working were young children because they could kind of fit into these tiny, tiny, tiny shafts. You could see what one of these industrialized cities looked like. They were pretty bleak, but there was actually some positives in some ways, if you want to say that. Cotton goods became much cheaper and now could be bought by all classes. The wages of the weavers originally rose very dramatically, and they were the best paid workers in England until the invention of the power loom. Between 1750 and 1850, the population of England England and Ireland, is going to triple. But this growth was very uneven. If you saw some of the earlier maps I showed you, originally it was centered in the south, but coal and iron production in the Midlands and the north is going to mean also going to develop the northern sections of England. In 1785, there were 3 major cities besides London in England. 70 years later, there were 31 major cities in England. Manchester was growing really, really rapidly. This becomes one of the centers of the Industrial Revolution. Before the mills were being built in Manchester, it was basically a market town, like basically just a crossroad of 2 roads intersecting, and it had no representation in Parliament. So one of the big problems with the Industrial Revolution for England and this massive urbanization that occurs in England is there's no procedure in place for the incorporation of all these new cities. There's no tax raising, there's no lawmaking powers, and this caused a lot of problems. Housing was very quickly built, and it was incredibly inadequate, and families would live in really shoddily built, originally single-family homes. The factories really required unskilled labor, and the skilled laborers, as a result, were degraded and thrown out of work. The wages for an unskilled laborer was not enough to support a wife and children, and because the work was so simple that a child could do the work, and you could see how little the children got paid, that was the preferred worker. Hours were really, really long, about 14 hours a day, and the work was incredibly regimented. You got very few holidays off, and unemployment was very common, and the workers were completely unorganized, and each bargained individually with their employer. And the factory owners really were very much self-made men, and they felt the landed gentry, the large landowners, were idlers, and they thought the poor were basically lazy. And they felt that they were doing the poor a job by giving them a job. And they were doing the poor a favor, by giving them a job. And they didn't like government regulations at all. In 1802, we're going to see the first attempt to regulate the factories, and that's called the Factory Act of 1802. And that was aimed at regulating the conditions of foundling children who were working in textile mills. Because the foundlings, which are orphans, were hired out by parishes, by orphanages. They had no family, so they had no protection. And basically the factory owners had the power of like a slave owner over them. They were apprenticed sometimes as young as 6, and they were forced to work for a master for up to 14 years. They would be housed and fed, but they would be locked up nightly, and they would get little or no pay. The Factory Act of 1802, though, was incredibly ineffective because there was no inspector set up to actually make sure that the children were not being manipulated and exploited. So the summary question here is, why was England the first nation to initiate the machine age? And had the French Revolution not occurred, would history have been different?